Good afternoon, and I welcome you to another edition of Working for You. Thank you very much for joining us for today's program. This is our first program since the August 5th general elections, and we now have a new government in place led by the Honorable Dr. Terence Drew. Thank you very much for joining us today for our program. As usual, we continue to bring you information with respect to what is happening in the government, in the ministries and departments of the government. Today, we are going to be having a discussion on disaster preparedness. Of course, we all know that we are in the middle, if you want to say that, and soon to be peak, the peak part of the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. And so it is important that we are prepared. Today, we are going to be having a discussion on utilities. And I have two members from the Utilities Subcommittee, of course, for NEMA. They're the National Disaster Plan, and they will be discussing the importance of utilities and what to do, what not to do, and the plan that they have in place with respect to disaster preparedness. I have with me Mr. Yeshua Melchizedek, and he is the Chief Technical Officer at the cable. Mr. Melchizedek, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the staff of the cable, and in particular the technical team. Thank you for all that you do. Just wishing you all the best this afternoon. Thank you.
Right, and then I have Mr. Colin Brown, and Mr. Brown is the Control, Operation and Protection Manager at SKNIS. Mr. Brown, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. On behalf of the St. Kitts Electricity Company, particularly the technical division and the technical team at SKNIS, we appreciate the opportunity to be here on the program and share our plans and our preparations for the hurricane season.
Right, so both of you, well, thank you for being here and for taking the time out to be here. The Utilities Subcommittee, when we are talking about disasters, of course, we have to talk about being prepared before the disaster, which is extremely important. We have to talk about what happens during a disaster, and then we have to talk about after the disaster, which is basically response and recovery and all of that. Now, Mr. Melchizedek, you're the Chief Technical Officer at the cable. We know how important telecommunications is with respect to disasters.
Yes.
Could you tell us something about the plan that the cable has in place, disaster preparedness plan that the cable has in place with respect to telecommunication?
Okay, thank you very much. In fact, I want to take a step even a step even further back, considering that the importance of the telecoms infrastructure. What we at the cable endeavor to do is, even in the system design, when systems are being built and implemented, we put things in place as best as possible to ensure that even if there is an incident that could potentially interrupt service, we have duplicate systems, redundant systems when we can, so that even if one fails, that the system is capable of continuing service. And in many cases, some of our customers may not even realize this. So if I give you a couple of examples, we have, coming out of St. Kitts, we know how critical the internet is. We actually have 3 links coming off of the island of St. Kitts heading to the US and landing at different places in the US. So again, even in the event that something were to happen on one internet link, the system has enough capacity to carry the traffic off island on the other two links. So our customers may not even feel that. And considering that, we think that we're thinking not only of incidents that may happen in St. Kitts. For example, one of the cables lands in New York and one of the cables lands in Miami. So if, God forbid, something happens in Miami, nothing to do with St. Kitts really, we have catered for that in the system design. And we also go down to power, for example. We have 2 standby generators at the station, and either one of them is capable of running the system if in the event for some reason one of them does not start. So even going back to the engineering and the design at the core of the network, we ensure that as best as possible we have systems that are duplicated in the event that something does go wrong, that the other one can run the system while we attend to the faulty one without having an interruption in service. And as we know, we are in the hurricane season, which is one of the primary issues that we deal with. But our plan, our robust plan, actually encompasses eventualities like fire, earthquake, tsunami, etc. And I will say at this time that I want to honor NEMA and express our appreciation for NEMA in helping us formulate this plan and validate this plan, because we work very, very closely with NEMA to do so. So the plan focuses on the mitigation, as we know, and we also have embedded within the plan the structures and processes are put in place for recovery. The processes and structures are put in place for response. And again, these are all tied into the national plan. As we know, as part of the utility subcommittee, whatever it is that we do in our response is in synchrony with what is happening at a national level. So the plan is very, very, very comprehensive. We have a number of different scenarios that we would consider in the event that we would have an incident to respond to. And we have also, in some cases, actually done dry runs and tests in the event that we need to respond. So again, just take the opportunity to say thanks to NEMA for having us put this plan together and being prepared in the event that we have an issue, that we can deal with it responsibly.
Right, so what I'm hearing from you, Yeshua, is that the cable has resilient infrastructure in place.
Yes. Yes,
in
absolutely.
case there is a disaster, in the event of a disaster,
yes.
You have resilient infrastructure.
Yes, yes.
And you recognize the importance of this resilient infrastructure because the importance of communication, and communication saves lives.
Yes, and I want to take another opportunity to say, even again, as we're talking about system design, some of our customers may be aware that we are building a new network at the moment, and we have taken the decision to put that infrastructure on the ground. And the primary reason for that is that there are incidents that happen. It can be, for example, an unfortunate accident along the road that hits a pole. It could be something as big as a hurricane. But the idea is that we build this infrastructure and we secure it on the ground so that the chances of it being impacted by a hurricane or by a vehicle accident is much less. And we do appreciate that even in the response to a natural disaster, the recovery of the entire island, the economy, the ability of our recovery efforts, our recovery teams to communicate and provide services is very much dependent on the infrastructure. So it's taking us a little longer to do that, we admit that, but the intention is that in our planning we ensure that we put it on the ground, and in that case ensuring, to your point, that it is a lot more resilient, a lot more robust in the event that we have an issue that affects us.
Right, because during a disaster, well, before the disaster it's okay, but during the disaster, that is when we have the problems.
Yes, yes.
You know, we have downed lines and we have downed, posts and all of those kinds of things. So it means then that you have to be very quick in your response.
Yes. Yes. So we have teams assigned to specific geographic areas. So we have the assessment and recovery teams assigned to areas. We also have priority areas that we would attend to. So for example, places like the NEMA office, the hospitals, the police stations and government offices are high on the response list, because we realize that if there is an issue, these offices need to have the capacity to be able to respond. So even in our response plan, we've prioritized the customers and the areas which we would give first priority in order to ensure that the recovery effort across the island of St. Kitts is at its optimum, because we'd have ensured that these areas are connected first.
Right. Now, Mr. Brown, the SKNIS, St. Kitts Electricity Company, and you're the Control, Operation and Protection Manager. Now, of course, during disasters, one of the things that, well, most times, you hear that so many people are affected in terms of outage, electricity outage. The place goes in darkness for, in some big countries, millions of people. In our small country, it could be the entire island, both St. Kitts and Nevis. So how do you address that? What are some of the mitigation measures that you have? What are some of the plans that you have in place for quick response and recovery? And what can you say to people in terms of, you know, what to do, certain things they should avoid that might be hazardous to them, and so on? I know there's a lot in that question, but
that's why I took a deep breath.
yes.
So let me start by sharing with the listeners and viewers of SKNIS' motto, which is reliability with responsibility. And by focusing on that motto and ensuring that our activities, our plans, and our preparations are always towards providing reliable electricity service in a responsible manner, we at SKNIS feel that dovetails beautifully and correlates with providing a reliable service during a hurricane disaster, and positions us best as possible to respond after a disaster. At SKNIS, the key document that guides our preparations and response is the Disaster Preparedness and Response Plan. This is a plan that was developed in coordination with NEMA. Again, similarly to Joshua, I have to thank and commend NEMA for their support and assistance and guidance in preparing that hurricane, that disaster preparation and response plan, which covers a range of disasters, but as hurricanes are the most significant natural disaster hazard for an electric utility in an island like ours, the principal hazard we address in that plan is hurricanes. So at SKNIS, in keeping in line with reliable and responsible electricity service, from the way we design, construct, and maintain our systems, it is done in a manner to provide as much robustness when the system is challenged. Whether that challenge be, as humorous as it may sound, a bird landing on a line, and whether the challenge may be as great as a Category 4 or 5 storm, and we have significant damage, and as you said, considerable outages, considerable equipment damage. The way we design and build and maintain our infrastructure is geared at providing a system that will be robust in the face of hazards and accidents, and as it degrades, as it suffers damage, it provides a reduced response as safely as possible to maintain electricity service to our customers. Now, we are in 2022, and I won't share how long I've been in the electricity service, but if I had been told when I started in the service that electricity would actually be more critical to our lives a number of decades later, I'll leave it at that. I would have said, well, how can electricity become more critical and more essential? But we are in 2022, and for communication, for safety, for security, for livelihood, commerce, economy, electricity, we recognize that SKNIS is the lifeblood. And therefore, we view our system just as we view the body. As a system, we are distributing a essential and important product and service, and we endeavor as much to continue providing that service throughout a storm and to restore the service when it is interrupted after a storm as quickly as possible. So our systems are designed with redundancies, with robust systems, robust equipment. We maintain our equipment. We replace our equipment, our switch gears in our substations, our lines. We upgrade our systems such that they're operating at peak performance. In addition to the challenge of providing service during a hazard, the nation is growing. The demand for electricity is growing. So we always have to keep our development and installation of infrastructure ahead of the demand, such that when one system, one line, one circuit fails, there is redundant capacity on another to allow continuity of service. As well as what we do within SKNIS on Island, we coordinate with our suppliers, we coordinate with regional bodies to provide, you would say, support when the challenge is greater than our resources, our internal resources. We recognize that often it will be an odd year when we do not have some impact from a tropical storm, given the region, given the risk of a tropical storm or a hurricane during the hurricane season. Sometimes we are impacted directly and we have a very major impact to our system. Sometimes we get the outer band, so to speak. I think that is the parlance. And so we are not significantly impacted. However, we recognize, and it is a practice for all the Caribbean utilities, that for a significant direct impact, our internal resources are not sufficient to rebuild and restore service as quickly as we would like. We want to restart business. We want to ensure security, support the medical services, the security services, and therefore we have partnerships and coordinations with neighboring utilities, mutual support and assistance agreements, such that when the impact is great, when the damage is greater than our internal resources and preparation can effectively respond to, we can seek assistance and receive assistance from our neighboring utilities, and in turn we also provide assistance to our neighboring utilities. Because as I said, while SKNIS and the SKNIS Electricity Company, and while I'm representing SKNIS, I will not leave out my colleagues at NEVLEC, while we may not have a significant hurricane impact every year some utility in the Caribbean has a significant hurricane impact. And so each one helps one in their time of need.
Right. I know that critical services, critical institutions must have some backup plan in terms of disasters, that they can keep going in terms of keeping the lights on. And keeping the energy flowing. For example, hospitals and things like that offer care to the sick, critical care, that if the electricity is off, then it could mean losing lives and things like that. I want to ask you, I know there's a lot of talk now in terms of getting rid of fossil fuels because of the harm that they pose to the environment. And one of the things, of course, climate action, the environment and climate action. The use of fossil fuels contribute to, they're saying, problems with the environment, which later on creates more powerful storms, affect the climate negatively. We hear about climate change, more powerful hurricanes, and all of that. Now there is a shift, or there's talk of a shift, of moving away from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. Do you think that by moving to renewable sources of energy, that would help significantly with, what you were talking about in terms of, keeping the lights on during a disaster and all of that?
I would say we at SKNIS more than think. We know that mitigation of climate risk and climate exacerbating the effects of the climatic associated hazards, whether it's global warming, release of greenhouse gases, and these are the factors. We know that as a modern utility in 2022, these are issues that SKNIS, for the long-term viability of the nation, the security of the energy supply in the utility language, these are considerations that must be taken into place and action that must be taken by the utility. So to step back and give a broader view, the SKNIS, as well as our sister utility NEVLEC, in conjunction with the Ministry of Public Infrastructure and in particular the Energy Unit, would have over the years conducted a number of what we term resource planning exercises. So integrated resource and resilience planning. How do we source our energy? What are the risks to that energy? And how do we provide a more resilient electricity service? As well as the risks we have already, or the hazards we have already identified in terms of climate, we also have to look at other hazards and other risks, specifically, let's speak of a hurricane or a major natural disaster anywhere in the world, or even the impact of COVID. When you disrupt shipping, when you disrupt economic and financial flows, you disrupt our ability to purchase and import fuel. I would say the majority, I wouldn't say all, but the vast majority, 90+% of the electricity we generate on island is generated from imported fossil fuel, diesel fuel in short. So a transition away from imported fuel to what we consider, or what we term indigenous energy sources, which aligns very closely with renewable energy sources. Energy from the sun, energy from geothermal, energy from wind, provides some measure of mitigation against various risks associated with how we produce energy now, by importing diesel fuel to burn in our generators. Our generators maintained and operated by our competent and hardworking team at the power station at Needmus. And they convert all this diesel we import into the island, into the electricity that's allowing our viewers to see us at home now. So we want to address the financial risk when the oil prices go up and down worldwide. We particularly feel it here on a small island because it costs us that much more to get the fuel here. So if we can mitigate against the financial risk, we can mitigate against the impact to the climate and the impact of what they say is the increasing climatic activity that makes hurricanes more prevalent, and when they happen, makes them of a greater magnitude. Moving to renewable energy sources helps us mitigate against that entire class of risks. To speak specifically of projects, For some time now, the federal government has had incentives and support for renewable energy for customers and businesses in the Federation. From a utility scale, there are two projects, two significant, what we'd consider utility scale renewable energy projects as compared to residential or small business scale. There is the Liclanche Solar Farm proposed to be constructed in the Bastia Valley. When that is completed, it has been in the preparatory stages of land clearing and construction during the COVID shutdown period. And when that is completed, that is intended to cover the peak energy consumption during the daytime period. It is a combination battery storage and PV farm, and the intention is that once that is completed, the peak demand during the day will be provided by PV as opposed to diesel generators. In addition, there are early discussions for a wind farm at Bellevue.
Right. Now, I know that we have a lot of overhead. We have a lot of overhead lines.
Overhead infrastructure, yes.
Yeah, overhead infrastructure. Now, a number of countries are moving a lot from the overhead to the underground. And we see sometimes what happens as well is that, you know, things fall in these lines and they pull them down, and it can create a lot of, you know, it can create fires and other disasters within a disaster. Also of people losing their lives and all of that sort of a thing, because there might be there's a live wire, they don't know if they venture out of their homes and all of that sort of a thing. So what is being done by SKNIS in that regard, because that is an important part of, you know, preventing, you know, other disasters from actually taking place within a disaster.
So you're correct, Lesroy. Underground infrastructure, it's an important pillar of a resilient electrical system. I'm pleased, I'm proud and pleased to be able to say, especially when compared to neighboring utilities of similar size, whether APOA in Antigua, Nevlec in Nevis, St. Kitts is blessed, the St. Kitts Electricity Company is blessed to have a significant amount of underground infrastructure as it is. The majority of our infrastructure is still overhead, but I can report that for every consumer of electricity in St. Kitts, some part of the infrastructure, some portion of the infrastructure that provides them electricity is underground. So whether they are fortunate enough to live in an area such as Frigate Bay or our business in Bastia, and the entire, their electricity delivery is entire underground, fortunately, or whether it's in another part of the community, let's say Sandy Point, for instance, where the electricity delivery, just as an example, would be underground from Needmos to as far as Challengers, and then would be overhead from Challengers to Sandy Point. The underground infrastructure we have in place provides us at SKNIS and us in St. Kitts with a much more robust electrical system when compared to neighboring islands. I will point out, and I hope I am not at risk of, you know, reminding of us of how last our major impact was, but during Irma and Maria in would that have been 2019? 2017, I believe it was, yes. We had Irma and Maria with two significant storms, who I think were spaced by about less than 2 weeks. And there are customers in St. Kitts who had continuous electricity supply throughout both storms. It is financially prohibitive to provide end-to-end underground infrastructure to all customers, and keeping in mind that underground infrastructure tends to be a factor of as much as 6 to 8 times more expensive than overhead infrastructure, and expensive as on a capital basis to install, and then their maintenance costs. But we continue to put new underground infrastructure. In the last 18 months, we've put a new underground infrastructure in the St. Peter's area, what we would refer to as the Bayfords feeder. We would have put that Bayfords feeder was the last remaining feeder that did not have any portion of it underground. So we put a new underground cable from College Street right up to Paris Housing. As well, we put new underground infrastructure, underground cable from Sandy Point to St. Paul, also to provide more resilience and support with the development in that area. The Ramada Hotel, the Kittition Hotel, the whole White Gate development. So it comes at considerable cost, but we at SKNIS think when we recognize that the investment is recommended, we make the investment to continue to extend our underground infrastructure. As well, for individual customers in a residential community, we are in early plans to provide more residential underground distribution as well. We recognize that as much as it supports the operations of the utility to have underground infrastructure to the nearest community, the individual impact to the customers have expressed to us that they are desirous of having underground infrastructure direct to their homes, such that they have that security that when there's a storm or hazard or any risk, vehicle accidents, birds and lines, etc., fires, bushfires that have a high impact on our infrastructure as well, they are protected from that.
Right. Now Mr. Yeshua, I know you spoke to how important your resilient telecommunication infrastructure and services, but I want you to tell me a little bit in terms of the resilience of your infrastructure. Not just how, an importance of being resilient, but the resilience of your infrastructure.
Okay. The core, which is basically our heartbeat, the heart of the business, we have, as I indicated, we have duplicate systems, redundant systems. So the likelihood of any one incident causing an outage is very, very, very slim. The equipment is in a concrete bunker. So again, the chances of the roof blowing off is non-existent. We are aware that sometimes the waves will impact the submarine cables that take the internet services off the island. So we have 3 exit points off of St. Kitts, and the chances of all 3 being impacted would be very, very slim. So from the core, the heart of the service, we are very, very, very robust. The distribution, which is the side of the network that comes from what we call our head end at Lagrit, going to our customers, some of that infrastructure at the moment is overhead. And it is subject to incidents like the hurricanes or in some cases an accident. This is one of the reasons that we have decided that the new infrastructure we are building, we are building this infrastructure on the ground. Having said that though, generally what we find is that even in the case where we would have had a hurricane or something would have taken the line down, usually the lines do not break as a consequence of the pole having fallen in a case like this. Often what happens is that if these lines are cut when the response recovery efforts are taking place, this is when service is actually interrupted, okay, in many cases. So the invitation here, the request here to our customers and the members of the public is to be very careful, both, and I'm taking a little bit from my colleague sitting here with me, that they may be down the power lines, and in some cases they would be down the cables, that in their efforts to clear, please do not damage the cables, because it is likely that when power is restored, that these services will continue to operate provided that the cables are not damaged. So yes, the existing overhead infrastructure is subject to impact by something like a hurricane. But the bigger issue we feel is when these cables are cut and damaged in the response and recovery effort, which is then when the service impact really takes place. In the future, that should not be an issue for us, because we've shared that we are building on the ground. We put in that infrastructure on the ground. Now, I want to take this opportunity to say that one of the things that we have also done at the cable is the hurricane shelters, primarily the community centers at this time. We have ensured that each of these centers will have access to internet services. So even if a customer may have had impact at their home, if they are within a hurricane shelter, the hurricane shelters are high on our priority list of recovery. So if someone happens to be in a recovery shelter, in the restoration shelter, they can get access to services as best as possible to continue. Again, it may not be as convenient as being in your home, but because we want to ensure that the services are accessible, we have, as part of our plan, ensured that strategically around St. Kitts, particularly the hurricane centers, the center of Basse-Terre, that we have services available to customers that in the event they cannot access it at their home, if they can find their way to a community center, a restoration center, that services will be available for them. So there may be impact as the infrastructure may have suffered through a hurricane, but we are putting things in place to ensure that there is continuity of service, of communication, while the rebuild effort takes place.
Right, and that communication is extremely important. Without it, that's another disaster.
Yes.
That's another disaster, because communication within the disaster, while it's during the disaster and after the disaster, is important.
Yes.
Tell me something. How quickly, like we've had hurricanes in the past, how quickly have you been able to restore your services?
All right, now that is a tricky one, because it very much depends on the extent of the damage. And what I might add is that the recovery effort, as we know, is very, very well coordinated. Okay, so when the infrastructure is being restored, we have our colleagues at SKNIS, because most of our infrastructure is on poles that are owned by SKNIS. So as part of the utility, utility subcommittee, we will coordinate very, very closely to provide as much support as possible with our colleagues at SKNIS to bring the poles and the lines back into service as soon as possible. So it is difficult to say how quickly we can respond, because it does depend on the extent of the damage. But I will also say, and you may hear me repeat this a number of times, but it is critical that we get that message out, that if the pole falls and the cable is not broken, the service will work. Okay, so please do not cut the cables, because even if the cables are down on the ground and the pole has been broken, our customers will continue to have service. Okay, so it may take us a bit more time to erect the poles and refasten the cables, but during that time, if the cables are not damaged, service will continue. So that is an important piece that we need to get that message out there. So yes, it is a bit difficult to say how quickly we would respond. It is very much dependent on the extent of the damage, but I will say that we collaborate very, very closely with our colleagues at SKNIS, and we work as a team to re-erect the poles, reattach the infrastructure onto the poles, that we can continue service.
A lot of your infrastructure is also on the ground, right?
Yes, yes, a fair amount of it is on the ground, yes.
Is on the ground?
Yes.
Right. So that in itself helps with the infrastructure not being damaged.
Yes, yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct. Not all of it, but we have, as you may know, we have a ring around the island that is currently in many cases on the ground. Much of our infrastructure within the Frigate Bay area, Basse-Terre area is on the ground. Not all of it, but a significant percentage of it is on the ground. And for the areas that are overhead, we will work very, very closely with our colleagues at SKNIS to bring up the services as quickly as possible.
What are some of the challenges that you have had in the response and recovery after a hurricane? I mean, what are some challenges that you would have had? Because sometimes we understand that public infrastructure is extremely important to mitigate against the full brunt of disasters.
Right.
Public infrastructure. And when I speak about public infrastructure, it is not just about telecommunications or electricity, but we have to have very good roads.
Yes.
And other public infrastructure in place. And sometimes if that is not in place, how does it hamper your response and recovery? For example, because the roads were so bad, it affects you in getting to certain areas to do the job.
Agreed.
Mr. Brown.
You are absolutely correct, Mr. Williams. While both of us here yesterday are members of the utility and wider the public infrastructure services of the company, we both depend very heavily on public infrastructure. And that bootstrapping, that coming up from everything is down, quote unquote, after NEMA gives the all clear, requires a significant degree of coordination. Before getting into other specifics, firstly, just the health and provisioning and wellness of our teams when we start to roll out is a considerable challenge. Ensuring they have sanitation, food, transportation, particularly for our guys who go out on that initial scouting after the storm. We post and position them strategically throughout the island with vehicles, and both of our utilities are part of what is referred to as, I think, the initial search and initial clearing, or the initial clearing subcommittee.
Yes.
That, along with the Defense Force, and Public Works, which is just getting the roadways clear, so that the security and health, as well as the utilities, can start to respond. As Yashua mentioned, the telecommunication providers are one of our priority customers during restoration. Security is one of our priority customers. The water department is one of our priority customers. I believe last I read the literature, I think as much as telecoms and electricity like to pride ourselves as essential services, second to none, and provide continuity of services, I think the most critical public utility service was water. I say in terms of, you can go X amount of days without telecom, you can go X amount of days without electricity.
You are correct.
But water supply had, I think, the tightest.
Yes, and not only water supply, you have to, because after a disaster, the water supply can be contaminated.
Exactly.
So people need to have water, yes, but they need to have potable water for cooking.
Clean water. Yes.
Clean water.
Clean water. So we often find ourselves in a catch-22, where we are depending on our sister utilities and sister services to support us to do what we have to do, and they are depending on us to provide a service so they can do what they have to do. And that close coordination between the telecom providers, Public Works, Water Department, electricity, and those other public infrastructure services, it's a continuous and year-round effort, cooperation, and particularly during and after a hurricane impact. We're on the phone with each other. Our teams are in communication and coordination hourly.
Because you're all interconnected in some ways.
And interdependent.
Because that electricity, if there's interdependent, if there's no electricity, how it affects my cable.
Yes.
And if there's no...
It affects my internet.
Yes.
If there's no communication, our communication between our teams to restore the power gets impacted.
Right.
It is quite an integral system, and with the coordination of NEMA and the support and guidance of NEMA, it is how we are able to respond. So our response plan does prioritize public infrastructure, public services, utility services are one of the priority areas immediately for restoration after.
But tell me some of the initial question that I asked. Tell me, what are some of the challenges that you have faced?
Okay. Particularly some of our infrastructure,
especially in the response and the recovery, because a lot of your work has to do with the response and recovery. As I said before the disaster, people have electricity. During the disaster is when the electricity goes because of what is happening, the battering from the rains and the winds and the down power lines and all of that sort of a thing. You have to clean all of that up. What are some challenges you have faced in cleaning all of that up?
Well, let me caveat first by saying we do not do it alone.
Yes, it's clear.
We have lots of assistance. So a considerable portion of our infrastructure is located in areas that are difficult to access, challenging to access, remote areas. So getting to those areas in the first instance safely is a challenge. We'll have to leverage heavy equipment, in certain instances mountain roads and such have been washed out. In certain instances, areas where we had infrastructure is no longer suitable for the installation of the infrastructure. The land has been washed out, undermining of the sides of guts and such. So that particular challenge of the terrain and the impact of hurricanes on certain terrains, even in how we send our teams out to inspect, just for there's a significant risk that the roadway that they expect to be there, the supporting infrastructure in terms of our substations and poles, if they are not where we expect them to be, and if they are not in a usable state, then our plans will have to be adjusted on the fly to accommodate that damaged infrastructure. So infrastructure in highly inaccessible and remote areas is the first instance, and then the second big challenge, when you have downed infrastructure in significantly populated, high residential areas.
Yes.
To do it safely while protecting the public. We all know we would like, us at SKNIS as well as the customers would like to restore electricity as quickly as possible, but safety is the primary aim. The secondary aim is to get electricity back on. And in doing it safely, sometimes it is not, it requires doing it at a more, I don't want to say slower, at a more controlled pace than would be expected just looking at it. So in instances, we will have customers saying, well, it's just a line, my neighbor has had power, or my neighbor has had internet for 2 days now, why don't I have internet?
Yeah.
And there are certain intricacies, there are certain challenges. We caution after a storm any down infrastructure that was on a pole, whether or not you recognize it to be electricity infrastructure. Stay away, stay clear, report it to SKNIS, report it to one of the other utilities, let us inspect. It is often the case that infrastructure that is not energized under normal circumstance, when lines become entangled, become energized after a storm. So someone say, well, I know that's the cable wire, I know that's the telephone wire. I touched that 1,000,000 times, it has not shocked me. After a storm, you because you just had a natural disaster and there's damage, there are multiple lines and wires entangled and wrapped up. You cannot take it upon yourself to presume what is the case under normal circumstance is the case after a storm. You see a line on your fence, you see a line on your gate, a line on your vehicle, and you want to take it off your vehicle and go and look around and see what happens. Do not do it. Call, report it to SKNIS or emergency hotlines, report it to the cable, any other utility provider, let us come out. And communicating that sense of caution, patience to our customers is quite critical in executing the recovery as well. But in built-up areas, that is the hazard of doing it as safely as possible, which requires doing it methodically.
Right. Joshua, what are some challenges?
Yes, so like my colleague, safety is of the highest priority. Whether it is just getting safely to the areas to do the assessment or the recovery, whether it is handling the infrastructure, which my colleague said could possibly be energized and entangled, the highest priority for us is the safety of our people. Even before we respond, one of the first things that we do is to make sure that everyone is okay. And not only that they are okay, but their family is okay, because we do appreciate that it is extremely challenging for anyone to be at work if there are issues at home with the safety of your family. So that is the highest priority for us, making sure that everybody is safe. Secondly is access to the particular areas in order for us to do both the assessment and the recovery effort. Again, must be done safely, considering that we just have had a disaster. The availability and access to equipment to lift and move and shift to assist in the recovery and restoration effort is also a challenge. But I must say that the mitigation plan that has been put in place with support from NEMA and the coordination and collaboration, as Mr. Brown spoke to a little earlier, then makes the resources that we need available to us, even if the cable may not own more than one backhoe in this particular instance. If we need something to help us shift, we can go through NEMA and the resources will be made available. The resources that we also have are all available to our colleagues also. So bringing these shared resources together within a pool provides us access to the machinery and heavy lifting equipment that we need, whether it is to clear the road or to restore the infrastructure. The other one, of course, is communication in order for us to best coordinate the restoration activity. So again, prime reason why ensuring that we have communication, whether it is satellite phones, whether it is that we hold cell phones from more than one provider in the event that we need to respond. Communication is also a big key for us in order for us to very easily, or as best as we can, coordinate the response and the recovery effort. So safety, number one, the availability of the equipment and access and so on, communication, and of course for us at the cable, we have a relatively small team, but what we are able to do is that in the event that we have a disaster that we need to respond to, our traditional roles then become null and void. So if someone from the downtown office who is normally let's just say a customer service agent, we may not necessarily need as many customer service agents at the front. So that person then becomes and supports the team out in the field as best as possible. So the traditional roles will change. The chief technical officer or the manager of sales and marketing or the manager of IT may step away from their traditional roles and adopt a secondary role in order for us to restore services as we pool our resources together. And of course, we have instances, as we said earlier, in the way that we coordinate, that if we need a pole lifted or we need some cables moved, we go through NEMA we contact and through our colleagues at SKNIS, and we get the support that we need there also. And lastly, there are some contractors that we can call upon in the event that we need support.
Right. So the whole objective is to restore the community to as near normal as possible.
Yes.
And you may have to deal with certain issues with people, you mentioned it, Mr. Brown, people being very impatient and wanting their service to be restored now. Of course, you know, we want our comfort. We are creatures of comfort. We want our electricity back, we want our cable back, we want our internet back. And understanding that, look, it might be a few days before you get it back. Sometimes people can be a bit impatient with respect to that, but nonetheless it's understandable. So your quick response to restoring these very critical services to people even helps with the psychosocial fallout that can happen after disasters. That is something that we don't normally touch a lot on, but people's, you know, being depressed and people and so on, you know, having these services back, the telecommunication, maybe to be able to call somebody and speak to somebody, you know, or to be able to play a game on the computer. All of those things can help people to cope with what they've been through. Do you agree?
Agree. Very much so, very much so. Even to take it a step further, so the policy of the company is to not proactively shut down electricity service upon the approach of a storm. As much as possible, the intention and the policy is to provide continuous service throughout the passage of a storm. And while there are significant benefits just to our operations from keeping the electricity service going rather than shutting down and then having to restart, we also recognize the psychological impact of, even if it is only a single light, being able to have your refrigerator powered throughout and being able to recharge your cell phone. It provides a comfort and a sense of security. Okay, so we are being impacted by a storm. It's a national emergency. Many things are not how they were yesterday, but at least my electricity is on, and that provides a sense of reassurance for customers. Throughout the passage of a storm, our call center, our emergency hotline is available, such that it is not the case that at any given instance throughout the passage of a storm, we can actually respond to what the customer is reporting. You know, a down pole, wire sparking, the lights fluctuating. However, the operator is there to provide a person to speak to the customer that's calling. That reassurance, okay, we are aware of the challenge you're having, the problem you're experiencing. The operator in many instances can give guidance as to what to do for the customer to minimize the impact of whatever has happened to their home and their appliances, and also to reassure them, okay, we will not be able to come out until the storm has passed. NEMA has given the all clear, but your fault is recorded, it's reported, and it's in the queue for response afterwards.
Yes. Now, what kind of feedback is given to NEMA? Because I can imagine that you would have to write a report. A report would have to be submitted to NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, because the whole thing is that to look at some of the weaknesses, to see how you can strengthen those weaknesses, to look at what went right and what went wrong, to look at how you probably could have responded quicker in certain areas, and that did not happen, to look at your team and how your team have been able to work and to work together and so on. I'm sure that that report is important in terms of looking at all these things so that the agency itself can help with the comprehensive disaster management. So one disaster is supposed to teach us something of what we can do to better mitigate against an upcoming disaster. Yes.
For myself or Yeshua?
Yeshua.
No, yes, you are correct. The way that we interwork and the relationship that we've established with NEMA and the structure that has been put in place, where even in the first instances, before we actually have an issue, the public utilities meet with NEMA to give an update as to where we are, any particular risk that we are aware of at the time, what we are doing to mitigate any particular risk. Communication through the disaster as best as we can, and also keeping NEMA updated with our recovery and response efforts. That provides all of that information. And quite frankly, what I would also expect is that because it is all coordinated through NEMA, something that, for example, that SKNIS may have had to deal with and overcome would then present information for us that will support us on our path of recovery. So keeping this information available throughout the event, keeping the appropriate logs as we do at the cable, that we actually have someone designated to keep a log of everything that essentially would have come through, and then providing that information and sharing that information with NEMA and our colleagues will provide an opportunity for us to learn and to ensure that the next time around either we can do something to mitigate against it, or we can respond more quickly, more effectively than we have in the past.
Yeah, Mr. Brown?
Very much likewise. I would not relate at this point how many reports we actually do submit to NEMA. But there is the readiness report that's given just prior to what is it, a hurricane watch or hurricane alert, I believe it is.
Yes. Warning and all.
Warning and all. When the NEOC is activated, there's a preparedness report that all of the agencies and members that contributed to NEMA has to give. Immediately after strike, there's an initial assessment report, both in terms of the capacity or the operational capacity of the system after the storm, and a rough financial estimate as to the cost of the impact, the financial cost of the impact, as well as outlining very quickly any particular needs to support the response that are unfulfilled. So as similar to what Joshua said, let's say after a storm we assess that we have 150 down poles and we know we only have 75 suitable poles in stock. We would communicate to NEMA, okay, one of the criticalities for restoration is that we need 75 of this type of pole or whatever equipment it is, and it is not on island, it is not in stock. So the agency as well can assist in helping us procure materials and support by quickly identifying and reporting those shortfalls.
Yes, so NEMA really should be the focal point in terms of, how the infrastructure was damaged and what basically is needed to repair that infrastructure, the cost of the damage, and of course what would be required for the cost of the repair.
Yes, the recovery.
The recovery.
Correct.
So NEMA is that agency, the government agency that provides that information, the estimated cost of damage.
Correct.
That a disaster caused in a particular country, and so on. So they're the official agency of communication with respect to that. I know that you mentioned the National Emergency Operations Center, and I do know that when it's activated as well is very, very important because it has key people who are stationed at NEMA to really deal with what is happening. So the National Disaster Plan actually comes into play here with all the various subcommittees. I think there are 10 of them The utilities is one, and there are other committees, communications, warning, and the Ministry of Health. So everybody has a role to play in disasters. It is not just the utilities committee, the subcommittee, but we all have a role to play in terms of preparing, mitigating, and the response and recovery. Because, of course, we're very small countries and we do not have a lot of resources. These small island developing states. And disasters can set countries back many, many years. Put their development back many, many, many years if we do not manage well disasters in a comprehensive way. There are some countries, you hear they have all this money put up that when disasters, and so they can go into the fund and pull out and all of that money. We don't have that in our small islands, and that is why we have to be so careful and prudent in the way that we manage disasters. On top of that, we are very small, and a lot of the effects of climate change, even though it is not caused by the very small islands, the bigger countries with their, lot of greenhouse gas emissions and all of that, we bear the full brunt.
In fact, disproportionately.
The effects disproportionately.
Yeah. Yes.
We suffer more than they do. The coastal erosion and all of that. We stand more to lose in many ways. We are going to go to the phone lines, and the numbers to call are 466-2666. That is 466-2666, 662-8674, 662-8674, 767-4765, and the overseas number is 1-239-645-4500. We welcome your calls. Right, so all before the disaster, during the disaster, and after the disaster are extremely important. But if you had to say which one do you think is most important, before, during, or after, what would you say?
And I guess saying all three is not an option.
It's not an option, but all three are important. But which do you think is most important?
I'll venture to go first. Hopefully I don't get the wrong answer. Preparation.
Well, I would say preparation too, but go ahead, tell me why.
Preparation is key, because substantially your response during and after can only be as good as your preparation. Mm-hmm. I'll relate a story. So the COVID, let's call it a disaster.
Yes,
which
it was a disaster. It's a health disaster.
And though we did not have a COVID plan, and no one could have expected generally to have had a COVID plan, it was surprising how applicable our disaster plan, which, as I said, has always primarily been hurricane focused, how applicable and how much we were able to rely on the mechanisms in that plan to respond to the COVID pandemic. And so it
stick a point there. Colin, I have a caller. Working for you, good afternoon.
Hello.
Yes, good afternoon. Hello. The caller doesn't seem to be hearing us.
Good afternoon. Lesroy.
Good afternoon. Yes, sir. How are you doing?
Lesroy.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Lesroy.
I'm hearing you.
Lesroy.
Oh, he's not hearing us.
Let's roll.
Okay. Caller, can you call back? They seem to have experienced some difficulties. I was hearing you, but you were not hearing me. Mr. Brown.
So, yes, so our experience has demonstrated and reconfirmed to us the investment we make in preparation, in developing our plans, in establishing the relationships with our partners, in identifying resources identifying resources that may be required during or after the hurricane. The dry runs, the practices, identifying of key persons, identifying their roles, all of that, our experience has demonstrated that you prepare, and as much as you cannot control how severe the disaster is, you can control how prepared you are to respond to the disaster. Some members of our team at SKNIS would have participated in incident response training. This is, as Yashua mentioned, it is often necessary and beneficial to have a different organizational structure and different roles during and after a storm. So the incident command training would have oriented our staff that during and after disaster, when you have roles such as incident commander, staging director, and these specific roles now that deal with how do you respond and manage to an incident, as opposed to managing and operating a utility on a day-to-day basis. Post that training, we saw a direct benefit into how comfortable, first of all, because preparing increases your comfort and reduces your anxiety when the incident does happen. Yes. And if you're comfortable, if you're not anxious, then you can apply the training, you can remember and identify the resources, you can communicate, and all of which makes the response during and after much improved.
We have a caller. Working for you, good afternoon. Working for you, good afternoon.
Leroy.
Yes, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, good afternoon, Leroy, and the other two gentlemen there.
Good afternoon. You're now.
Now,
yes.
I have a complaint here, Leroy.
Yes.
And yeah, I'm listening on the radio. But anyway, I have a complaint here, and I spoke about it 2013 and 2019
Turn your
and 2021.
down in the background. There's some feedback.
There are 2 coconut trees on the hillside of Lodge Village, and they're hanging over the street, and God forbid that a hurricane should break down any one of those trees. They're going to drop on the high tension wires, and they're going to cause a lot of havoc over here. A lot of people's house over here will be in danger. I spoke about it, and a lady said that she's going to look into it. Well, I don't know if she look into it or she look over it, but the tree is hanging over the line. 2 coconut trees, and they're serving no purpose because nobody picking no coconut off of them. So they're only there to cause a disaster. So I'm asking you all, please come over, lads, and look at those trees on the hillside of the project, and move them from over the power line. Because if they bust down on any power line there, somebody could get electrocuted. I'm asking, please. This is about the 5th or the 4th time I asking them to come and cut them down, because we don't want anybody to get killed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and he mentioned a good point. I'll allow you to answer, Colin, but he's speaking there to disaster risk reduction. You know.
So thank you, caller. I'll respond in two parts. So yes, I will acknowledge that trees represent a risk, are a hazard and a risk to much of our overhead infrastructure, all of our overhead infrastructure. And when trees do fall on lines and fall on poles, it will cause damage, some degree of damage, and it's something we mitigate against, we manage, and also we are aware of, and we are challenged to respond to after a storm. That being said, and I'm taking note, caller, of Lodge, the 2 coconut trees in Lodge. We live in a community, and as well as the utilities, infrastructure, and services being part of the community, our environs are part of the community. So it becomes often a balancing act of managing the risk. It is not every tree that poses some hazard to our infrastructure that in every instance we will choose to cut down, or at least cut down at the moment it is reported. We need trees for beautification, we need trees for community, we need trees to mitigate against greenhouse gases. So, and I'm not minimizing the risk or hazard customer. However, I will ask all our customers to be mindful, A, that where a tree, fruit tree or decorative tree, is on private property, it is the responsibility of that property owner to manage their trees in a way that it does not pose a risk to the utility. In an instance where a particular tree is an imminent risk, meaning the branches are already in the lines, already impacting customers, we will have to address it in order to continue to provide or restore service to the customer. But as I said, it is not every tree in every instance that we could speculate if it falls, it will fall, that we will cut down proactively. Some trees provide beautification, some trees provide community gathering place, or some other community benefit. And we are mindful at SKNIS that we try to balance our aggressiveness with pruning and cutting down trees with the impact on the community.
On the environment.
And on the environment. And we are aware that there are trees, many more than those 2 coconut trees in Lodge, that if they fall, I could just use the example of the beautiful flamboyant trees along the lawn in Greenland. We are aware if those trees fall towards Keon Street, the cable and SKNIS is going to suffer infrastructure damage. We would not dare suggest. We prune them conservatively, and we would not suggest cutting them down as well. I know the customer stated the coconut trees are quote unquote serving no purpose, but in many instances before we cut down or even prune significant trees in the community, we would want to have some dialogue and sensitization, because believe you, we do hear from members of the community when we cut down trees that are long-standing landmarks, so to speak, in the community.
All trees basically serve
a
purpose. We know, of course, that trees give off oxygen, the oxygen that we need to breathe, and they take in carbon dioxide and all of that. It's the reverse of us human beings who breathe out carbon dioxide, but we need to take in oxygen in order to survive. So trees are an important part of our survival, providing oxygen for us, and of course other benefits to the environment. They are habitats for, for birds and other forms of
pollination with bees,
wildlife, pollination of bees. They hold the soil compact together, that prevents soil erosion and all of that. So trees are always important. However, I do not want a tree that is going to fall on my house and create a disaster. And so therefore I may have to cut down that tree. Not that it's not important to the environment, and it has some benefits, but that I do not want my house
impacted
by a falling tree that is bending towards my house. So I agree with you that there's sometimes some trees, and some of them can be pruned and and all of that. But definitely there are some trees, because of where they're situated, it's better that they be removed because of the devastating impact that they can have in a disaster, falling on people's homes, electricity lines and all of that, or even falling on people and vehicles.
And I'd like to interject, Lesroy. While our primary focus in our pruning and tree cutting efforts is the protection of the electrical distribution infrastructure, in coordination with NEMA, both the utilities, both the cable and SKNIS, also participate in general pruning for security of roadways, security of people's homes. In the preparatory period for the 2022 hurricane season, both the cable and SKNIS would have partnered with NEMA to prune trees in various areas.
Yeah.
Some a hazard to our lines, but some not directly a hazard to our infrastructure, but putting persons' homes at risk. So that as well is undertaken. But to the caller, if we have fallen short in terms of providing you with feedback on our assessment and our plans for those 2 coconut trees in Lodge, we will make an effort to contact you directly, but do not conclude because we have not cut them down that your previous reports and your concerns were not taken into consideration.
Okay, good, right. Now, Joshua, the question I asked in terms of before the disaster, during disaster, and after the disaster, what is your response to that? You probably would say the same thing as
Yes.
Mr. Brown, because the preparation is important to mitigate against the effects of the disaster or the impact of the disaster. And so therefore preparation is actually key. And that is what is basically stressed, because there is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yes.
And so therefore preparing becomes extremely important. I know that NEMA continues to do a very good job in terms of putting information out to make people aware. Being aware of your environment is important. Being aware of what is happening with the weather and the climate, is important, because if we are not paying attention to those things and if we are not educating ourselves, education is key, then of course we could be in for a lot of trouble. And so that is why both of you are here today to speak in terms of what you are doing to ensure that, when we have disasters, that you can respond as quickly as possible, that you can help to save as many lives as possible and restore communities to normalcy, and that is extremely important. So I want to thank both of you for being here. Mr. Melchizedek, like Melchizedek of old in the Bible, the priest Melchizedek, and Mr. Brown from the SKNIS, 2 very, very important utilities, that of electricity, energy, and that of telecommunication. So thank you very much for being here and for sharing with the public what you are doing to keep us safe with respect to disasters.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our listeners to today's program and our lone caller. I want to thank you very much for tuning in to Working for You for today. We will be back with another edition for Working for You next week. Until then, take good care. I am Lesroy Williams.